Is Oliver Twist anti Semitic? These are the kinds of questions that we often face today. Was Shakespeare anti Semitic in The Merchant of Venice? How do we deal with works of art? And I'm thinking especially today of literature. How do we deal with works of art that seem to express values that we today are not comfortable with? Consider a book like Gone with the Wind. Now, that's a complicated issue because we're talking about a book written in the 1930s about the 1860s. So, when we find in there perhaps elements or tropes that we consider racist, are they expressing the racism of Margaret Mitchell, the author? Or is Margaret Mitchell simply expressing the racism that was apparent at the time that the book was set? If we're dealing with racism at the time that the book was set, then surely we can't criticize the author for realistically representing those times. Surely we shouldn't expect a writer then or today writing a book about an earlier period, we shouldn't expect them to sanitize the way people spoke, thought, believed, acted in that day. We don't want them to misrepresent or whitewash history. At least I hope we don't. I'm sure with Gone with the Wind, there's probably a mixture of both things. We have Margaret Mitchell's own attitudes mixing with the attitudes that she's expressing about the 1860s. Well, if Margaret Mitchell herself had questionable views about race, does that mean that she should be blacklisted? That we shouldn't be reading her book? That we shouldn't be allowing other people to read her book? Well, certainly I hope we don't ever consider simply censoring or black banning a book just because it reflects views of an earlier time. But should we be self censoring? Should we be saying, look, I'm not going to read that book because of the views it expresses? Let's set that question aside for a moment and return to it later. Now let's consider the case of Oliver Twist. The book is sometimes criticised because the character of Fagin represents a stereotype, or perhaps actually more a caricature of the Jew. Now, I think that's a bizarre criticism because almost all of Dickens' characters are caricatures. Mr. Bumble, the beadle, for example, doesn't exactly come up smelling roses. Dickens painted very unfavourable pictures of a whole range of characters throughout all of his books, and I don't think it's fair to single out Fagin and say that therefore that book is anti Semitic. It might just as well be anti Beadle. Now, those books reflect an earlier period in our history when people held different values. We don't really have to go back very far to find questionable values in literature. The 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, probably even 5 years ago, we can find something that in today's atmosphere is considered questionable. But what of someone who writes something here and now and who expresses views that are unacceptable? What if someone today writes a book in which there's a character like Fagin, and not an historical character, but a present day character? Someone who paints an ugly picture of a Jew and it affects the way we look at Jews, or an ugly picture of someone who may be gay and it presents an unflattering and prejudicial view of homosexuality. Do we feel comfortable reading a book like that? And then there's the question not of the work of literature itself containing questionable material, but of the author of the book behaving in a questionable way. We may be fine with the books themselves, they may not express any values that we find questionable, but then we discover that the author themselves engage in questionable behaviour. Perhaps we discover that they've been involved in sexual abuse or child abuse or racist activities. Does that then exclude us from reading their works? Now, all of this is addressed not towards a censorship imposed by society, but upon self censorship. How far do we self censor our reading if we discover that the values in the book or the behavior of the author is questionable? Well, I think in terms of a book like, say, Oliver's Twist or Gone with the Wind, or going further back to Shakespeare, then we can be aware that they're reflecting views of an earlier time, and we can bear that in mind as we're reading it. We're capable of holding that idea in our mind. We can read this book while at the same time being aware that this reflects a different era. And I don't see anything wrong with that. We're simply reading that book in an educated way. It's not presumably going to sway our views about people of a different race or Jewish people or anything like that. We recognize that that's part of the culture in which the person lived at the time, and we don't have to accept those views, but we can value and appreciate other aspects of the book. The situation with an author or perhaps a painter or a musician that we find out has questionable behaviour is somewhat more difficult. For example, a few years ago, an Australian stroke British performer by the name of Rolf Harris was convicted of a number of counts of indecent assault. Those of you not in the UK or Australia may not know who Rolf Harris is or was. He was a television entertainer who made a number of children's programs. He put out a number of novelty recordings, and he was also quite respected as a painter. He, in fact, was commissioned to paint a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. When he was convicted of these charges, the value of his paintings plummeted, and people couldn't offload them quickly enough. Now, if these paintings were considered of good quality before he was convicted, were they no longer good quality? It seems that the value or worth of a painting doesn't lie in the painting alone. It also lies in some way in the person who painted it, in the provenance of that painting. I'm not sure why this should be. Perhaps we fear that we ourselves are somehow tainted if we retain or buy such a painting, as if it shows some kind of support for that person, some kind of support for his obnoxious behaviour. The idea is quite ridiculous, really, and we ought to be able to separate the two things. We ought to be able to separate the painting from the painter. But we obviously find that very difficult to do. I think that if I find a book good, if I enjoy a book, and later I discover that there was something really awful about the author, I'm not really going to not like that book anymore. I may be very disappointed in the author. I may be disappointed to learn that that person behaved in such a way. But I hope I'm mature enough to appreciate that the book itself is a work of value. I think we struggle with the idea that someone who may in some way be morally corrupt can nevertheless produce a valuable work of art. Yet I think that's probably true throughout history, that many of the people who produce great works of art, whether they be painting, music, books, there's always something questionable in their behaviour. None of them are saints, and maybe we shouldn't actually expect them to be.